Hello, my name is Juliana Smith. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon for our webinar. I am the South Coast Project Manager for the Beaufort office of the Coastal Conservation League. And before we get started today, I wanted to make sure to give you all an important update, and that is that the Zoning Board of Appeals meeting has been postponed until August. That is the meeting that was scheduled for this Thursday and was the meeting where the Bay Point Island developers' application for the special ecotourism use permit was going to be reviewed. And so that's been delayed until August 27th at the earliest, and we will let you all know updates as we learn them. But in the meantime, we're going to move forward with our webinar today to learn a little bit more about this project. You all will have the opportunity to ask questions, and you can do that by typing them into the chat box you should see on the right side of your screen. And we'll go over as many questions as we have time for at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to enter those questions in during our presentations, and we will go over them at the end of the webinar. Our webinar today features three panelists. They are Dr. Rob Young, Geology Professor and Director of the Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines at Western Carolina University, Mr. Dean Moss, retired Executive Director of Beaufort Jasper Water Sewer Authority and a local here in Beaufort, and Dr. Phil Dustan, Marine Biology Professor and Marine Ecologist at the College of Charleston. Our panelists today are going to be discussing infrastructure needs and impacts on undeveloped barrier islands like Bay Point Island, and how those islands themselves and the way they shift and move can impact infrastructure that is installed. And so with that, we'll get started with Dr. Rob Young.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen. We are in the middle of a severe thunderstorm warning that I just received with 60-mile-an-hour winds and hail. So if I disappear, you know what happened. I fear that this is going to put an end to my zucchini and yellow squash in the garden. What I want to say today about Bay Point Island is pretty straightforward. It's a bad place to invest and a bad place to build. I'm going to let my colleagues talk a little bit more about the ecological impacts of the development. I'm just simply going to talk a little bit about the practicality of developing this extremely low elevation, very dynamic, very narrow barrier island on the South Carolina coast. We all know that sea level is rising, and that rise has been accelerating. We've been measuring it via tide gauges and via satellite altimetry for many decades now, and there's no question that sea level is rising. We see that rise clearly at the Charleston tide gauge, and anybody who spends any time in South Carolina is well aware of the fact that nuisance flooding has been increasing in downtown Charleston fairly rapidly over the last few years. So sea level is rising. No matter who you want to believe is causing it or why it's happening, it's my roof is shaking from the thunder. I don't know if you can hear it or not. There's no debate about the fact that sea level is rising. You can argue about who's causing it if you'd like to, but we're measuring it directly. We see it in front of us, and that rise of sea level is driving changes in the coast. This is a beautiful barrier island off Cape Lookout National Seashore that is rapidly moving inland, eroding, overwashing. But the beautiful thing is that Cape Lookout National Seashore as I feel like I'm in a Frankenstein movie. Cape Lookout National Seashore as an ecosystem has no problem with sea level rise. Um, the barrier island is able to move, it's able to migrate, it's able to overwash. This overwash is great habitat for things like piping plovers and certain nesting shorebirds. Shoreline change itself is not a problem for barrier islands. It's not a problem for the physical system. It's not really a problem for the habitat. We are taking a look at this section of coast that I call the Hunting Island headland. Hunting Island is one of the fastest eroding shorelines in the US, but through that erosion, it supplies sediment both to the north towards Harbor Island, and it supplies sediment downdrift to Fripp, Pritchard's, Capers, and eventually, at the end of the system, Bay Point Island. So you can see some sand shoals here where the sand is coming across from Capers to Bay Point Island, landing right about in this area, right here. So Bay Point is a part of this overall sedimentary system, and in order for Bay Point to maintain itself, it needs to get enough sand from up here in order to offset any rising sea level or storm impacts. Well, the problem is that much of that system itself is collapsing. So here is the University of South Carolina Beaufort's Marine Station on Pritchard's Island. You can see here the extremely rapid change in Pritchard's. You can see the collapse of the maritime forest. I assure you that this is not where they built the marine station 20 years ago. Here's the marsh, which is now in front of the island. You can see the marsh peat as the island is rapidly receding. Much of Hunting Island, Pritchard's, and Capers looks like this on its interior. You have a collapse of the maritime forest, and largely this is happening because the water table is rising up underneath these barrier islands. So it's not simply being caused by storm surge and oceanside erosion. On these very narrow barrier island systems, the water table is actually coming up underneath, and you cannot support the same maritime forest that you once were able to support. Precipitation doesn't perk. The systems are getting wetter and wetter, both from nuisance flooding coming in from the sea, but also underneath as the water table rises. Hunting Island itself has seen dramatic erosion and collapse of their interior and maritime forest. And in order to hold this shoreline in place, we're now spending tens of millions of dollars to engineer it with what some people would call a dune. I like to call it a shell hash dike myself. But in order to try and hold this shoreline in place, it's costing a tremendous amount of money and constant shoreline engineering. So let's just take a little look at what Bay Point Island has been doing for the last couple of decades. So here we have a picture of the entire island from 1999. You can see there's some nice accretionary sand ridges down here. A reasonably robust maritime forest on the island connecting all the way across here. This is all vegetated. This is vegetated in 1999. And when we jump to 2019, what you can see is this end of the island has sort of fallen apart. This has fallen apart. The central core of the maritime forest has shrunk dramatically. And this is still the relatively most stable part of the island. But the entire island is very rapidly changing in response to rising sea level and storms, and a reduction in the amount of sediment that's coming from the Hunting Island headland making its way down the coast. This area right here does tend to be relatively stable compared to the areas on the other sides, because this is where the shoals are coming in and attaching. But it really gives you a false sense of security. So here we are in 1999, just looking at the west end, you can see that these beautiful sand ridges from a period when the island was growing, and if you jump to 2005, they've almost all disappeared. So the west end of the island is very rapidly retreating and narrowing on both sides. If you look at the interior forest of the island, which as recently as 2012 looks pretty good, following Hurricane Matthew in 2016, there was a tremendous loss of vegetation in the island. And we look at 2019, and that vegetation is just not coming back, okay? And it's not gonna come back, and we're only gonna lose more, because as I said earlier, this is a very low elevation island. There are not large interior dunes in here. There's not a lot of sand volume. The water table is coming up in the interior of the island, and we're losing all of this stuff in here. I would say that within the next 10 years, there will not be any trees viable on this island. So if you're planning on developing this as an eco resort, the only trees that you're going to be able to have on the island within the next 10 years or so are going to have to be in pots, because the rate at which the island is shrinking and the water table is coming up is not going to provide for the ability to maintain that maritime forest. So again, if we look at the northeast end of the island, I want you to focus on this salt marsh in here. And you can see the northeast spit has shrubs, and it's relatively well vegetated and grassy as early as 2008. By the time we hit 2019, that marsh is almost gone. The entire northeast end is rapidly migrating inland and closing up. So again, we go to 2008, here's the salt marsh that I'm talking about. Here's this vegetated spit, and we go to 2019, most of the vegetation is gone. Here's the marsh out here now, and we just have a little bit of sort of upland vegetation, shrubs hanging on the entire north end of the island. So what it's leaving us is just this little core that has shrunk dramatically from both sides. You can see the dying vegetation in here as the water table rises. Vegetation that dies from storm impacts is not going to be able to recover. This is the alleged stable portion of the island where there's very little dry beach left. It's a rapidly eroding shoreline. And, you know, in my opinion, at the end of the day, this would be a terrible investment. So I'm not going to comment on the environmental impacts, but if I was looking for a place to invest any money at all, it's just not going to be here 10 years from now. It's not going to be a viable place to have structures. Your only hope of protecting those structures would be massive coastal engineering, which would be incredibly expensive and environmentally damaging. You're not going to be able to support this maritime forest. So this is a collapsing barrier island. We see these up and down the coast of South Carolina. This is not just unique to this particular island. It's simply not a viable place to put any kind of permanent development, unless you want to go out there and put 3 or 4 yurts or something like that. And unless you're able to recoup your investment about 5 or 6 years, this is not a viable place for any kind of a development. And I would hesitate to call the development in a place that is this unsustainable as ecotourism. You know, in my mind, an ecotourism development has to both bring people into nature, but you've also got to build some place that's going to be sustainable over the long term. And this is clearly not a sustainable place to build. Thanks. And I guess, sorry, I guess Dean will be up next.
Great, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Dean Moss, former general manager of Beaufort, Jasper Water and Sewer Authority. My comments are going to be based on 3 things, and I'm going to focus principally on the utility infrastructure that's proposed for the development. and the groundwater situation that underlies the island. Basically, my sources are what the developers have proposed, and I've reviewed their documents, at least the ones I had. And secondly, what I know to be fact in this community. And then thirdly, what the DNR and DHEC hydrologists have opined or concluded based upon what they experience in the surrounding area. I'm not a hydrologist. I'm not an engineer. I have been working with water and water supply issues in this area for over 30 years. So I claim expertise only in that. Based upon their submittal, effectively they have proposed for their water supply approach, they need 40,000 gallons a day of potable water. They need 60,000 gallons of fire suppression capability. They don't give a flow rate. They don't give a gallons per minute or anything else. So you can make a judgment on how long that 60,000 might last. And they have suggested that there are 3 sources of water for their project. First is rainfall harvesting, and they are estimating up to 30% of their need will come from rainfall harvesting. Secondly, sewage effluent, and they have estimated up to 30% will come from sewage effluent. And the rest will be made up by groundwater. They've proposed storage, above ground storage of about 200,000 gallons, underground storage of around 100,000 gallons, and apparently cisterns, 25 at 3,000 gallons and 5 at 5,000 gallons. Presumably the cisterns would hold the rainwater. They're not specific on that. And as I can look at, the cisterns probably are designed to go with each of 25 residential structures and 5 at conceivably the non-residential structures. On their wastewater side, they are estimating that they're going to need to get rid of about 30,000 gallons of water a day. And they're proposing approximately 10 septic tanks with disposal fields. They also are requesting and plan to request a, quote, decentralized system to generate water for reuse. I got some comments on these before we go too far into the groundwater. The first is, can all this be made to work? Sure. You spend enough money, that's the beauty of water and sewer utilities. You put enough money in the ground, you can make anything work. But it's got to be permitted, and that's, my experience tells me, somewhat easier said than done, particularly in a situation where there's an enormous amount of interest and concern about things. And it's going to be enormously expensive to build and enormously expensive to operate and maintain. Depending on the rainwater harvesting, for 30% presumably of their potable demand would mean about 13,000 gallons per day on an average day from this source. We haven't had any rain here for a few days, 95 degrees out there. Probably not going to be generating a whole lot of rainfall into the harvesting system. But I assume this will be collected from roof drains directly into the cisterns. That kind of is the implication from the number of cisterns versus the number of buildings. There will be water quality issues. Presumably these buildings are going to be built in the forest. There will be leaves, there will be bugs, there will be bird poops. There will be things in that water that are going to have to be cleaned before it is, quote, potable. And so if they want to do something other than that, then they will need to clear or utilize an open space, a substantial open space, to put in rainfall harvesting, a rainfall harvesting system. And then they've got to pump it into the cisterns. But otherwise, it's a bit touchy as far as I'm concerned. Could something be made to work out there with enough storage? Yes, I'm sure. But a significant amount of storage. 200,000 gallons of above ground storage. It's a pretty good sized storage tank. And it will be very visible. It's not something you kind of hide. You're either looking at it or it's taking up an enormous amount of high ground. Septic tanks are not going to produce effluent. They're saying that they're going to generate 30% of their water demand from effluent, but then they indicate they're going to use septic tanks. The septic tanks do not produce effluent. They've got to get rid of that septage into the ground. As was mentioned, the groundwater tables are pretty close to the surface. And so it's going to be tough. If they go to a more complicated manufactured leach field system, that's enormously expensive effort and will require the import of a lot of soil. Assuming that the effluent would only be used for irrigation, if they build a wastewater treatment plant, then they're going to have that stored separately. They can't store it with the potable, and they probably are not storing it in the ground. I would expect DHEC would frown on that regardless of the quality of the water in the aquifer. It can't be used for potable use, and without storage, it's not really available for fire suppression. So underground storage is possible. We've done underground storage here in Beaufort County, aquifer storage and recovery. You pump into the aquifer and you pump it out. The quality requirements to do that from DHEC are very high, and the aquifer has to meet very specific criteria. There are no details in the proposal describing the aquifer or anything about the specific water to be stored there. So effectively, the principal reliable source of water for this development will be a well drawing groundwater from the aquifers beneath the island. But what do we know about that aquifer? Well, specifically, we know nothing. No groundwater investigations have been done on the island by either state or federal hydrologists, and if private research has been done, it's never been published. We have to assume that the aquifers under the island are going to be similar to the aquifers on the surrounding islands. And there are two aquifers of note that we're concerned with. The superficial aquifer, a shallow lens of groundwater that lies close to the surface, pretty much recharged by rainfall, and really is the source of all the water for the plants and animals that occupy the island. Once you lose that superficial freshwater source, as was mentioned previously, you start killing things on the land. Underneath is the Florida aquifer, or portions thereof. And that aquifer, which is in various configurations, underlies all the islands in Beaufort County and the mainland of southeastern South Carolina. As a general statement, the aquifer was for centuries the principal drinking water source for Beaufort County. But beginning in the early 20th century, the overpumping started the process of salinity into the aquifer, saltwater intrusion into the aquifer. And by about 1960, large portions of northern Beaufort County were experiencing problems. The Beaufort Jasper Water and Sewer Authority was created in '62 to bring in a reliable source of water. In the 70s, water lines were extended on to St. Helena and then to Harbor, Hunting, and Fripp Islands, since the native groundwater was becoming too salty to use. Northern and central Hilton Head Island wells are now all too salty to use. The Florida aquifer gets closer and closer to the surface as it reaches northern Beaufort County, and therefore the shallow seas and the salt marshes between St. Helena and Bay Point have invaded that aquifer and effectively rendered the entire aquifer salty. To the extent that rainfall on the island provides some recharge to the limestone, this is very limited, and presuming that it works the same way as on St. Helena, any pumping will quickly bring the salt water back to the well. As a general statement, I think that this salt water, this Florida aquifer is overlain in most of the way by an impervious layer. And I think what we're seeing in many cases is that impervious layer is essentially sitting on top and has now reached the surface in this area. And so that explains a lot of the presence of just standing fresh water. And there is apparently, in rainfall seasons, lots of standing fresh water out there. It can't infiltrate, and it has a hard time sliding off the island into the surrounding marshes. We can assume that the water in the center of the island is less salty than around the edges, but intense pumping, and if we're talking 40,000 to 100,000 gallons of water a day, that will quickly bring much saltier ocean water toward the well. The water quality doesn't get any better as you go deeper, and there is, and I quote, and not quote, but I emphasize that there is no reliable potable water that can be reached by a well on Bay Point Island. There's no evidence that pumping this amount of water from beneath Bay Point Island will impact on the regional groundwater, for example, on St. Helena. But it's possible that some impacts could be felt on neighboring St. Philip's Island. Without a detailed analysis and some pump testing in the installed wells, it's going to be hard to know for sure. There's a well on the island, which was put in many years ago, and reports from people who tried to use it or were familiar with it indicated it was salty when they put it in, and they've never been able to get water out. Therefore, the groundwater from the well is going to have to be treated, and this will require sophisticated reverse osmosis treatment plants. Such treatment plants are expensive to build, and they're very expensive to operate and maintain. They take some fairly significant expertise. They require a lot of energy because the water is being driven to a very high pressure and forced through special membranes. They produce a very highly mineralized effluent, which depending on the saltiness of the influent water can be twice as large as the clean water produced. That means that the volume of water that you are having to discharge, for every gallon you get, you're going to be discharging probably 2 gallons. So 2/3 of the water you pump up is wasted. Since it's got to be designed for a predictable quality of water to be treated, the design is going to have to wait until the well has been installed and tested at a high rate of pumpage for some period of time. That's basically what I have. I haven't talked on the notion of a wastewater treatment plant, but the challenges for such a wastewater treatment plant are not dissimilar from the reverse osmosis treatment plant. They're expensive to run, they're expensive to maintain. They produce sludges which have to be disposed of. So from a utility management standpoint on the island, as I said at the beginning, can it be done? Yes, it can be done, but it is enormously expensive. These facilities take up valuable high ground. They have to be maintained and they have to be operated. They require enormous amounts of electricity. So that's all I have. I've tried to be as factual as possible. Again, if they want to do it, they can figure out how to do it as long as they're willing to pay the dollars that it's going to take. But again, as he indicated, it may be a 10-year investment, and somebody's going to have to take that stuff off the island at the end of the day. Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce Phil Dustan from the College of Charleston.
Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you all. Let's see if I can share my screen. Yep, good. Okay, we're going to switch gears quite a bit. I happen to be a marine ecologist. I study coral reefs in my spare time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the flat earth mentality that we're dealing with here. And just to introduce myself, I'm an ecologist. I'm a professor at the college. I've been a Johns Island resident on and off for 20 years. Been part of the aquarium design team, a bunch of other stuff within the city, including some of these planning commissions. And I won the City of Charleston Stewardship Award in 2010. But I want to talk about reefs first because not only do I love them, but they're interesting and we're dealing with resorts here. So you have to think in terms of a reef is an ecosystem, not a resource, okay? All the parts are necessary to keep that system operating. And reefs are, unlike what we're talking about now with marshes, they have real high sunlight, low nutrients, low sediment, real clear water, but there's a set of environmental conditions that they need to exist. And then there's a set of symptoms that we see in reefs, and I would urge you to develop this for these islands and marshes, but we see diseases, we see excess algal growth, sediments, crown of thorns, similar sort of things like Rob was talking about with the way the beaches are changing now. Similar sort of symptoms. And in diving tourism, especially in remote areas, people are bundled into lodging units. And those lodging units can be a homestay, a resort, or it can be a live aboard yacht. which can have upwards of 30 or 40 people living on it. Same sort of thing that we're dealing with here. We're going to bundle people into cabanas or little tiki huts or whatever. And those people that visit the reefs would like to have a Western infrastructure in a very remote location. So they want alcohol, they want comfort, they want air conditioning, they want luxurious service, etc. Same sort of thing with people coming to a resort in Beaufort. And there are unintended consequences that follow this. The deforestation and destruction of land, the overall chemical pollution and the sewage pollution, overfishing, disrupting animal behavior, many different things. Similar sort of things happen in the marshes of South Carolina. And humans basically take stuff, break stuff, and pollute stuff. We do three things, basically. And what I want to show you is a little model that suggests that the very adaptations that allow reefs to thrive make them vulnerable to humans. And in some respects, the same thing with the marshes we're dealing with. This is a little model that shows people, and people through urbanization, increasing sediments that smothers reefs, and people that overfish reduces the carnivores, and they change the food web, and then the benthic algae are no longer eaten by fish, and they smother the corals. And they produce sewage that fuels coral diseases and fuels the growth of algae, and so on. So it's a similar sort of thing. And I think it might be instructive to try to build a little mind map like this for these marshlands we're dealing with. I think of a hypothetical human that arrives, and it could be a local person, somebody that's lived there all their life, and they might do some fishing, they might do some hunting, but they're probably not going to want as much resources as, say, a diver that visits, or an underwater photographer, diver, or even a scientist. But in other words, every single human has a particular type of impact. And people have said environmental degradation is like being nibbled to death by ducks. So think of humans as this hypothetical duck. And just to give you one example, this is a lot of numbers, I realize that, but this is what I call human waste poop day estimates for Raja Ampat in Indonesia. This is a very remote place. So you can add all these up. You know, what we've done is we've taken liveaboards, resorts, local people, etc., and we've come up with two numbers. In 2000, that number was 9.7 million roughly. And in 2018, that number was 26 million. So that's a 374% increase in just the amount of human poop days going into this pristine environment. Same sort of thing is going to happen in a marsh. And what that means is the reefs become nutrient sinks, and they shift. They no longer become, they're no longer reefs, they're nutrient sinks. And what happens if we think in terms of the way populations grow, populations tend to grow up to their carrying capacity. And this human impact, all the sum of all these human impacts pulls that carrying capacity down. Okay? So what I'd like to suggest is a marsh is an ecosystem, not a resource. All the parts are needed for that marsh to be sustainable. And if we look at satellite maps of this area, we can gradually see the coastline. This is Charleston. Beaufort's down here. We can see the beaches and the sediment coming off the shore. And if we get a little closer, we look at Johns Island here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with development on Johns Island. And Johns Island is really a series of high dunes, as you see in this LiDAR image, and lower swales with the marshlands between us.
Phil, if you're sharing slides, we can't see them.
Kiowa, I'm sorry?
I said, if you're sharing slides, we're still seeing your first slide. I'm sorry to interrupt, but.
Oh man, what is going on? Let's see. Let me stop this for a second.
Okay.
And you can see this slide, right?
Yeah, I see that.
Any others? Who's sharing? Am I sharing or are you sharing?
You are sharing. I think if you try again, it seems like it might.
Again, yeah. I'm not seeing the Zoom bar. I apologize, but let me go back into this.
If you go into slideshow, maybe that will help, because it looks like we're just looking at your PowerPoint program
No, I realize that. And now we're going to back out of that. No, what I'm trying to find is I'm trying to get back to Zoom.
While we are getting this figured out, Rob, there was a question in the chat earlier when you were going over the aerial images of the island, and they were asking, Claire was asking about the dying vegetation, saying that it looks pretty green on the island, and I didn't know if you had anything to add to that, what's going on there.
Well, certainly the central portion of the island still has some maritime forest and green vegetation. And, you know, if you look at the trend of change over the last 10 years and what's going on other islands within the state of South Carolina of similar size, you know, we're going to lose it, and we're going to lose it sooner rather than later. And when the vegetation dies back, that little barrier island will start overwashing during storms, and it'll start moving inland. And that's, you know, sort of the life cycle of these small coastal barrier islands in South Carolina. So from the perspective of natural systems, it's really not a great tragedy that this happens. This is what these little barriers are supposed to do. And, you know, there are many of them doing this right now up around Cape Romaine, but it's, you know, it's going to happen. And you're right, it looks reasonably green right now, but it's not going to be that way in 10 years, guaranteed.
Thank you. And Dean, there was a question for you as well. What would Beaufort County be obligated to pay in terms of supporting infrastructure? So you're talking a lot about how expensive and how much infrastructure would be needed out on the island.
Well, that's a question I probably can't answer. It depends upon what role Beaufort County decides to play, what kind of financial relationship they would establish as a result of the development agreement and what they obligated themselves to. In theory, all the investment on the island would be made by the developers. The concerns that have been generated generally about Beaufort County's future role in many ways revolve around emergency response what happens.
Jump out of this and come back.
Okay.
My computer's hung up. I don't know why. It had to do something with not being allowed to share and then doing the share. Now let me see.
Now you're good.
Okay, now you can see me, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try. See, what happens is the mouse is running back and forth. Hang on, I know how to do this. Let's try this. All right, now we're going to share. And is that good?
Yes.
Okay. So let me run through the pictures. I'm sorry. I will show you back, and you can post this. All right, we'll be able to post this later, so that's no big deal. But so this is what we're talking about. We talk about reefs. We're talking about really rich ecosystems, and these are all the little homestays and cabanas and liveaboard boats that are there. And these are the things that tourists demand when they go to a place. You know, of course, there they want good guides, they want alcohol, they want air conditioning, they want to see megafauna, etc. And you'll have that same experience. And that requires a very significant supply chain infrastructure and capital investment. And the unintended consequences of that are things like runoff and physical damage and overfishing and disruption. And again, you'll see that. And this is humans that take stuff and break stuff. And this is that little model I was telling you about, where you can sort of begin to look at the impacts of deforestation or overfishing or sewerage. And I would think that you could make one of these for this particular system. I don't think it would be too difficult to begin to assemble that. But maybe some of the local people in terms of the cultural resources as well. Because I have a friend in Beaufort and he grew up camping on that island. So again, you think of the hypothetical duck who's nibbling this environment to death, or the diver, This is the idea where we were estimating poop days, talking about essentially in the Dampier Straits in Indonesia, we went from 9.7 million poop days a year to 26 million poop days a year in 18 years' time. 374% increase in the amount of human waste going into the environment. This is going to be significant. So this is an important graph because normally we think in terms of the number of individuals in the population growing up and reaching their carrying capacity. And all of this nibbling by the ducks, essentially the human impact, pulls that carrying capacity down. And so what system is there now is going to have to deal with the essentially the competition from humans that's going to be there. So I would suggest to you that a marsh, very much like a coral reef, is an ecosystem. It's not a resource. It needs all its parts to be there. And here's the satellite image I was showing you of the low country, Lakes Marion and Moultrie and the old Santee River here, all the way down to the edge of Beaufort, with Charleston in the center. And Johns Island, which is this island here nestled in with Wadmalaw, is a barrier, sort of next to a barrier island with sea islands. And if you look at it, like you'd normally look at a satellite image, all you'd see are the different farms and houses and roads and marshes and things. But if you look at it with a LiDAR image, you see that the topography is based on the red being high and the yellow down to blue being lower. So what we've got here is a series of old dunes that were built in about 100,000 years ago during the Pleistocene, when sea level was higher as it receded. So if you begin to look at this sort of mapping, what you see is that where people built their houses were along the high points. Like this is Maybank Highway that I'm highlighting here. And down here is the airport dune from the airport all the way across. And this is where we pick up Bohicket Road and going down. So the locals built their houses on the high parts and they farmed in the lowlands. And if we examine now, we look down here where Bay Point is. This is a different image. But here we can see this bright white impervious surface of Charleston and the developments, and then Johns Island, and you can see it's creeping towards Beaufort. And you can see it here as well. What we're dealing with here is a pretty good undisturbed system compared to, say, James Island in the Charleston area. We get a little bit closer, we can begin to see that as well. So this is the thing, in the Stono, we're dealing with a tidal river. It's between Wadmalaw Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. It's classified as shellfish collecting habitat. And the runoff that comes off the land impairs that shellfish collecting by adding fecal coliform to it. And it's very sensitive, as I'll show you, to the input of water from different sources. And, you know, ecologically, we think of goods and services from marshes. We think of marshes being really helpful for us. They're the homes of lots of animals. They're the nursery ground of all the commercially and recreational important species in the fisheries. They purification plants, etc. And they buffer us from storms and sea level rise. Oh, and they produce a lot of food. We found in the Charleston Harbor project that as pressure from urbanization increased the development of the watersheds, we found that the creeks became contaminated. And when that impervious surface got to about 5%, we would see changes. When it got to 10%, it was detrimental, and at 30%, it was damaging. So as we build impervious surface, and what that does is the water washes off the land as surface flow. So Charleston, in its wisdom, is considering a 20% impervious surface for new developments. Okay, so if we want to have natural resiliency, as we've heard, water cycles. On Johns Island, it cycles through the forests. It cycles through the forests on Bay Point Island as well. They absorb water, they release water, they dampen storm winds. They do all kinds of things for us. And they're slowly dying, so like we could hasten that. And that's called the landscape, the water balance of the landscape. So the statistic I like to suggest is an acre of forest will shed about 750 gallons with 1 inch of rainfall, and a parking lot will shed about 27,000 gallons. So not only do they want to pump water, but the water is going to run off and go into places as well, maybe. What we find on Johns Island and elsewhere in the Low Country is that stuff is very disruptive. And the hydrology from fill and build in general, overall, the whole development where they take out the forest and put in a development is extremely damaging to the hydrology of the area. And this will give you an example. This is tidal height. If you see these little ups and downs, this is tidal height. It's measured by a level gauge that's very precise within about a 2 or 3 centimeter accuracy. And along comes Hurricane Dorian, and this is low pressure in the top here. You can see the pressure drop and then the rainfall increase. And what you see in that slide below it, in that red, is the excess water coming down Burden Creek, which is where we have extensive fill and build. And 2 things happen. We have sheet flow that enters the estuary, and that's very low in salinity. And then over time, like over the next 8 or 10 days, the system bleeds water. And that water is relatively low in oxygen, high in bacteria and organic carbon and nutrients, and it generates fish kills that depletes essentially the vibrancy of the marsh. Now, in that same rainstorm, if you look on the very bottom where it says Hoopstick South, that's the forested watershed in the same area. So you can begin to see just the impact of development on the marshes where these watersheds are. Now, Hurricane Matthew is a slightly different scale. This is the rainfall from Hurricane Matthew. And we were dealing with, in our area, we were getting upwards of 8 to 10 inches of rain and maybe more, especially Savannah. Charleston got about 8 inches of rain. Savannah got a little more. And I want to show you just what happened in the Stono River. Here's the pressure, the atmospheric pressure. So we see the eye of the storm coming over on the 8th, 2016, at 7:50. There's the storm surge from the level gauge that was in the river. So we know that's the storm surge. Now, with that storm surge came tremendous amounts of rain. And what we saw over the next 4 or 5 days is the temperature of the Stono River dropped from about 25 Celsius, which is, I guess about 78, something like that, down to 21, which is about 70. So we lost somewhere on the order of 7 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the chilling effect of the water. That suggests that the rainwater being cold actually made the river cooler. And if we look at the salinity, we can see the same thing. We can see pre-salinity values are about 32 parts per thousand on the high tide and a low tide of about 23 rather. So we go from 33 to 23, about 10 degrees. As that rain came, we can see a dilution in the runoff. The runoff's actually diluting the Stono River down to about 7 parts per thousand 5 to 6 days later. This is all of the stormwater washing out of West Ashley, diluting the river. And the same thing happened with dissolved oxygen. It dropped down in some places almost 25, 30% at low tide. Now this is what's going to kill the larvae in the marsh. So again, we get up to this idea of human impact degrades the marsh, it degrades everything by pulling down the carrying capacity of that ecosystem. And we need marshes. We need these nursery grounds. We need them to do their goods and services for us. We need them to be a place for enjoyment, and we need them to buffer storms. If we were to develop that island right now, it's like making a roadmap for the next storm surge, just to wash over it and go further inland, okay? So we have these unintended consequences of tourism. What can you do about it? I would suggest you build a model like this, and we can begin to pick out what all of those little pieces are. And when we come to look at this, we also have to realize, as we've heard, sea level rise is coming. It's suggested that even with commercial property in Charleston, we're going to see a dramatic decrease in the value of property, especially. And I'd like to leave you with the precautionary principle that implies we have a social responsibility to prevent the biosphere from being harmed by people. It's just like if you went to the doctor, the first thing the doctor does, the first rule of being a physician is do no harm. And that's what we have to do here, do no harm. So I'd like to leave you with that. And with that, thanks. And I'll stop sharing if it'll allow me. Yep, great. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Dustan. We really appreciate that. And I believe now we are going to open it up for questions. So I know, Dean, we were talking about the obligation for Beaufort County to take care of those utilities should they be built out there. And I'm not sure that you had finished your answer. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to wrap that up if you needed it.
Well, if the infrastructure is built out there, if the island is to be developed, then it's obvious to me that whatever development agreement is entered into between the county and the developers has to make a provision for that island to be cleaned up if the development is destroyed by a storm or abandoned in some way or another. The only reasonable way to do that is to require a bond to be posted, which will be sufficient for the cost of doing that, in addition to making the requirement. Other than that, the county's responsibility really will rest, I would think, more on the emergency management side of things. If someone has a heart attack, if someone is badly injured out there because of what they're doing, there's going to have to be provisions for evacuating them, and that probably is going to fall into the arms of Beaufort County EMS, the Ladies Island St. Helena Fire Department, and that may require special equipment. It may require, other things that we don't have right now in place. But that's all speculation on my part. I don't want to speculate on it, but clearly there is some implication for the general operations of the county as a result of this development.
Thank you. And another question we had from Parker Moore has to do with the salt water underneath the island. So is the rising sea level issue a matter of salt water intrusion of a freshwater system below Bay Point, or is the system entirely saline? As a follow-up to that is, if it's saltwater intrusion, do you anticipate that the development as proposed would cause drawdown of the water table that would exacerbate that intrusion as sea level continues to rise and cause the impacts to occur even more quickly? And I'm happy to reread that if you'd like.
No, I think I got it. The current aquifer beneath the island and the current aquifer, effectively the Floridan operates in a series of layers. And the upper Floridan, which is the aquifer that we've used traditionally in Beaufort County as a water supply source, at that point on the map of Beaufort County, that aquifer is salty. It's been salty, and out there on that island, it is always going to be salty. The lying air, the aquifers lying beneath it are salty. They have salt water on both sides of them to the extent that they're emerging toward the surface. There are limestone outcrops across St. Helena Sound, which are the results of the uplift of that aquifer pointing out into the sound. So the aquifer is reaching the surface there. The limestone is, and it's going to be salty with or without this development. The pumping of that aquifer can increase the salinity of it simply by pulling seawater directly in to the underlying aquifer, where it may not be quite as salty as it could be. But as a general rule, that impact is, in my opinion, going to be pretty localized. It's not going to have a significant impact on, I don't think it'll have any impact on St. Helena or Hilton Head. But as I said, we just don't understand enough about the aquifer to know whether it could have an impact on St. Philip's Island.
Okay.
There's also this very shallow aquifer that is the groundwater right at the surface on the island that is going to change as sea level rises. And that groundwater has a thin freshwater lens that floats on top of what is basically salty water. And as sea level continues to rise, that little bit that is mostly fresh water is going to slowly but surely over time get smaller and smaller. And that's what's going to stress all the vegetation that's on the island, because that maritime forest can't grow in salt water. And so that this is a much shallower local groundwater that we're talking about here, not sort of the drinking water source. So I'm not quite sure which one of those aquifers the question was addressing. But you know, that system has been changing over time and will continue to change into the future as sea level rise continues.
Thank you. Another question that has been asked has to do with the trash that will be moving from the resort back to the mainland. And Dr. Dustan, can you speak to how that could cause ecological risks with increased boat traffic and the movement of waste through the marsh?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things that go on here. Number one, you have to think about the trash being generated right there, and that will be a lot of just wrappers and things thrown down and discarded that won't be picked up, and that'll generate a lot of microplastic. It only takes about 6 weeks for a plastic bag to break down into microplastic in that sort of environment. That'll be a larger vessel maybe, and it'll stir up the delicate marshes and put a lot of mud into a water column that normally isn't there. And a bunch of that will probably fall overboard. If you've ever been behind a garbage truck, you notice the ooze that comes out of it and how it stinks on a hot day. Well, that's sort of garbage ooze, and that'll probably ending up in places too, and it'll get into the water table and just mush around. Yeah, and there'll be, there's organic and inorganic and also toxic waste. I would imagine that people aren't going to be able to deal with the mosquitoes that are there unless they use copious amounts of things like off and probably various kinds of insecticides. And we know that those insecticides kill the insects that live there, and they don't just kill mosquitoes. And they get into the fish. They're very harmful in many cases in parts per billion, parts per trillion. So again, that's part of that being nibbled to death by ducks by humans.
Hey, Juliana, it's also important for everybody to keep in mind when we're talking about any burden this may place on the county or on the locality that, this area is in the coastal barrier resources system, right? So federal funds are not available for anything, any infrastructure, disaster relief, or anything like that on this particular island. So because this is a part of COBRA, it's gonna be a part of COBRA. That this is the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. It means that federal funds are not available to assist with post-disaster management, cleanup, shoreline protection, anything on that particular island. So to the extent that there is a requirement for any public cleanup, remediation, post-storm assistance, it's going to be local or state. It's not going to be the feds.
Thank you.
Juliana, I'm going to jump in here and say goodbye. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and I think we'll wrap it up there. I do see one more question from Richard, and I'll answer that. It has to do with DHEC and DNRs.
Thanks, and thanks everybody for listening. And I'll send you my talk so you can post it.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks, everyone. So we will wrap that up. Richard, I will send you an email, and I appreciate everybody tuning in today. If you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to email me. And of course, as a reminder, that Zoning Board of Appeals meeting this Thursday has been postponed to August 27th at the earliest. So we'll keep you updated as we learn more. And thank you so much again to our panelists for joining us this afternoon.